The Pottinger Ultimatum. The Road to the Takedown of Jeffrey Epstein. By VEdmore, that's me. J. Stanley Pottinger, one of the lead lawyers representing victims of Jeffrey Epstein, was directly involved in covering up Watergate, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Kent State Massacre, and he played a vital part in the standoff at Wounded Knee, the case of Orlando Letelier and CIA domestic surveillance, Iran-Contra, and the October Surprise. He had shared an office with Epstein, run arms with him, and he had even lived 500 meters away from Epstein's Florida house from hell, prepared to see the Epstein case in a completely different way. Welcome to the Pottinger Ultimatum, my friends. Welcome. The road to the takedown of Jeffrey Epstein. And we will eventually get to the takedown of Jeffrey Epstein. I promise you that. In March 2005, the first official police investigation of Jeffrey Epstein began in Florida after a family of a 14-year-old girl reported that she had been molested at his Palm Beach residence. However, the police investigation wasn't a surprise to Epstein and his inner circle. In fact, Epstein was already aware of multiple accusations surfacing against him, and his high-profile trips with former President Clinton in 2002 had assured his fate. Epstein's cover had been blown wide open for the first time and led to him receiving a slew of unwanted media attention. Epstein later reportedly told a friend that same year, "If my goal was to stay private, traveling with Clinton was a bad move on the chessboard. I recognize that now. But you know what? Even Kasparov makes them. You move on." In 2005, as the Epstein cartel learned their operation could no longer stay hidden, a clear and obvious ultimatum formed. If Epstein took no action, the consequences would be dire. For over a decade, Epstein had molested and raped girls systematically at his various residences. On average, young girls were presented to Epstein 2 to 3 times every day. If those numbers are even close to accurate, then Jeffrey Epstein alone was guilty of more than 8,000 separate counts of sexual assault on largely underage victims. His vast wealth had allowed him to offend at a scale which was truly shocking. On top of that, if Epstein had been held to account for his many crimes, then this would have consequences for his extremely powerful associates too. Over the years which followed the initial police investigation, a plan was put into action which saw Jeffrey Epstein's network take control of not only his own legal team, but also most of the legal team who represented Epstein's many victims. When Epstein was first convicted, he infiltrated every level of authority, legal team, and essentially took control of every stage of the process. By the time he was incarcerated, his cell door was routinely being left unlocked, and even though he was supposedly being punished for the sexual assault on minors, he was essentially allowed to continue with business as usual. When he was arrested again in 2019, Jeffrey Epstein had not only formed his own defense, in fact, he was forming the prosecution's case against himself too. By 2014, John Stanley Pottinger was ready to come out of relative retirement for one last job. The fourth act of Stanley Pottinger. After leaving the Justice Department, J. Stanley Pottinger assisted Chemical Bank in identifying and obscuring their previous risky business practices. He headed up Mead's legal team as they resisted a takeover from Dr. Armand Hammer's Occidental Petroleum. In 1980, he was in court defending the arms smuggler who was reportedly working on behalf of the CIA, while in the very same year, Pottinger himself was also to become a CIA-backed arms smuggler. During the same year, he was also assisting high-ranking CIA officials to organize the October Surprise, which helped swing the U.S. presidential elections in favor of Pottinger's very close friend, George H.W. Bush. Officially, Pottinger had practiced law in Washington, D.C. until 1981, when he supposedly left the law firm of Troy Mailing Pottinger to become an investment banker in New York City. It is here where Pottinger claims to have accrued most of his wealth. Although, as we will discover in this article, how he actually made his money during this period is questionable. Whether Pottinger had really made his money in banking or whether he was instead compensated in some other way for his central role in organizing Iran-Contra and the October surprise has never been investigated properly. During the same year in which J. Stanley Pottinger broke up with his long-term CIA-affiliated partner, faux feminista Gloria Steinem, he began to play the field for a while before eventually laying low in Mexico. But by the late 1980s, Pottinger's friends sat in the highest office in the land, and with George H.W. Bush in charge, he no longer appeared to fear prosecution for any of his high-level intelligence activity, his arms dealing, or for his manipulation of an American election. It is noted on an archived version of Pottinger's official website that by the late 1980s he was also forming new affiliations with various powerful interest groups. His biography concerning this period states that in 1987, Pottinger became a trustee of the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights, while also serving as a member of the United Nations Association Advisory Committee for Multilateral Projects. Although the details of that specific UN project appear hard to come by, Pottinger's own website also makes note of his work as a consultant for the Rockefeller Foundation. If we skip forward a little to the mid-1990s, we discover Pottinger had entered what a syndicated Washington Post article by Paula Spann called a fourth act. In an article entitled, "Here's a Man Who Can Honestly Say He's Done It All," Spann states, he was a Washington creature in his 30s, a powerful official in Nixon and Ford administrations, and lightning rod who went on to be a Washington lawyer. He was a Manhattan fixture in his 40s, an investment banker and guest at the swellest small dinner parties, now 55 and silver-haired, looking quite at ease with jeans and sweaters, existence in a quiet sky-lighted house on a lake. He jumped the track successfully once again. Spann's article announced a new stage in the life and career of J. Stanley Pottinger as he became a best-selling author, with his first jaunt into the world of fiction writing being a medico-political thriller entitled The Fourth Procedure. It was clear that Pottinger was entering a much more comfortable and relaxed pace generally. The latter piece paints a distinct picture of the new Pottinger. A successful writing life has just got to be the best, he says, happily propping his feet on a coffee table while going on about the pleasures of research and the fact that one can write just about anywhere. It's more mobile than painting, easier than photography, less equipment. I think it's a great life. I hope I'm able to sustain it. If not, I'll have to consider alternatives. The article also quotes Warren Dennis, a former Justice Department colleague and law partner of Pottinger, as saying, he, Pottinger, reinvents himself every few years, but his ability to land on his feet and turn in a stellar performance is unusual. He has a golden touch. What the article doesn't mention about Warren Dennis is that he was at one time a member of the Anti-Defamation League. Warren Dennis was also still practicing attorney during the mid-1990s, but for the very special group of former government employees, as mentioned in 1998 CNN article entitled "For Secret Service, Proximity is the Issue" by Bruce Morton, which states, "The agent is put out of the car on the next ride and out of the car on the next ride," says Warren Dennis, an attorney for former Secret Service agents. "And in the future, between now and 5 years from now, if you have enough hundreds of incidents when an agent is put out of the car or asked to step away from proximity, we will have an assassinated president." Like Pottinger, Dennis had handled some very sensitive cases after leaving the Justice Department. He helped design and implement bank examiner training and compliance programs for the federal bank regulatory agencies, but his main focus was representing former members of the Secret Service. In fact, Dennis had represented the director of the United States Secret Service in connection with grand jury investigation into the impeachment of the president. His very original role saw him serve as counsel to every living former head of the Presidential Protection Division of the Secret Service with respect to the question of Secret Service protective privilege in those same proceedings. What's intriguing in relation to this case is that Warren also served as outside counsel to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which had been established by Congress as a law enforcement clearinghouse to coordinate efforts to rescue missing and abused children throughout America. The aforementioned Span interview had taken place in Pottinger's New York home, located in Westchester County, a property on Twin Lakes Road in South Salem, and an address which continues to be Pottinger's base of operation. Pottinger had bought Twin Lakes property from Robert Fox in 1989 for $675,000, but that wasn't the only property he purchased around that time. Pottinger also purchased another property in July 1990 for the much pricier sum of $2.5 million at 616 Island Drive in a subdivision in Palm Beach from a couple named Gregory and Janice Holloway. All the homes within the vicinity of Pottinger's new Palm Beach residence had been erected in the early 1950s, including the home of Jeffrey Epstein at the infamous 358 Albrillo Way, only 500 meters away from Pottinger's residence, and which also cost $2.5 million to purchase. Epstein also moved into his Palm Beach residence in 1990, leaving Jeffrey Epstein and Stanley Pottinger as close neighbors. In fact, Pottinger and Epstein's Palm Beach property had also been advertised by Martha A. Gottfried, Inc., which listed both 358 Albrillo Way and 616 Island Drive as open house on the 4th of March 1990 in a Sunday edition of the Palm Beach Daily News. However, only a month later, Kathy Shapiro was listed as a representative to contact to view Epstein's future Palm Beach residence, and the property was now listed as being offered by Sotheby's International Realty. This may explain how Epstein first found the property, as this occurred while Les Wexner was on the board of Sotheby's auction house. It should be noted that Epstein eventually received a markedly discounted price, $750,000 off the original price for the Palm Beach property, with the original listing priced at $3.25 million. The Epstein's house was designed by architect John Volk, who coincidentally also designed much of George Huntington Hartford's Paradise Island, a man who I once described as the original Jeffrey Epstein. Volk died in 1984, but had designed 2,000 projects over his career, and his legacy was kept alive by his wife, Jane. So, as you may have seen there in here, over here, that's Albrillo Way. That's where Epstein was. And over here is Stanley Pottinger's house. So that's how far away they were. They were literally just a stone's throw away. Tarpon Island, in between, Todd Michael Glazier, who owns that, was the one who bought Jeffrey Epstein's house, demolished it, built a new house. So there's lots of close connections there. Whereas Epstein's Albrillo Way property was sold by Sotheby's, Pottinger's future Palm Beach home, described as a sensational new waterfront regency with dock on the prestigious Everglades Island, was instead eventually being offered by J. Richard Allison Associates and Rita Whiteley Associates. A long pause there. Pottinger also didn't get much off of a reduction on his $2.5 million Palm Beach home. I put 2.5 Palm Beach home, which was being offered for $2.95 million when it had last open house advertisement run on the 22nd of July 1990. 4 days after that open house viewing, John Stanley Pottinger filed company information for Colt Communications Inc., which he registered at 616 Island Drive, backdating the allocation of the property as the company HQ to the 22nd of July, 1990. If one was to believe that this was the first time J. Stanley Pottinger had been in close proximity to Jeffrey E. Epstein, you'd be wrong. Their previous dealings included smuggling illegal arms as part of Iran-Contra scandal, as well as Pottinger's claim to have shared an office with Epstein while they were both working in investment banking, which we'll learn about more later in this article. It should also be taken into consideration that the supposed sharing of an office could simply be a cover story for some part of the organizational process behind the Iran-Contra affair. Pottinger now had two homes, a lake house to work from and a luxury Palm Beach property in among the rich and powerful elites. By 1995, Stanley Pottinger had spent 5 years learning to write fiction novels as an obvious antidote to his mundane retirement, and after his first release became a bestseller, he appeared on The Charlie Rose Show to promote his new career path. His girlfriend, Gloria Steinem, used to love going on The Charlie Rose Show. The year after Pottinger became a best-selling author, his mother, Eleanor Chittenden, passed away at the age of 84. The Dayton News article announcing Eleanor Chittenden's death also makes note of Stanley's wayward brother, who had once trafficked an underage girl across state lines for sex, David F. Pottinger, as being based in Hawaii during this period. Random House's Ballantine Books published The Fourth Procedure in April 1995, with the novel being translated to 10 foreign languages. The book found its place on all US hardcover best-selling lists, including that of the New York Times. Pottinger had always seemed comfortable as a writer. He had previously written articles for Barrister Magazine, Change Magazine, Journal of the American Institute of Planners, the California Law Review, Self Magazine, as well as the New York Times. It should also be noted that for many of the Nixonian era's political elite, writing fiction had already become second nature. Pottinger's literary career had gotten off to a flying start, and his second novel, A Slow Burning, was published in hardcover by Dutton in March of 2000 and softcover in July 2001. He was to follow up with a third novel, The Final Procedure, in 2002, The Last Nazi in 2003, and his final work of fiction, The Boss, was originally released in 2005 and republished again in 2006. In 2005, Bob Woodward, one of the original Washington Post journalists to unravel large parts of the Watergate scandal, released his own book In the Secret Man. Woodward doesn't only reveal the identity of the Washington Post main source, known as Deep Throat, for Watergate as being the former FBI's director, W. Mark Felt. He also explained Pottinger's vital role in hiding this information. Woodward explains that in 1976, the then Assistant Attorney General, Stanley Pottinger, had revealed to him that Felt had given his secret identity away while testifying before a grand jury. The Washington Post reported in June 2005 that, asked, "Were you Deep Throat?" Felt initially said no, but his stunned look alerted Pottinger to the possibility he was lying. The same article also states, in that grand jury proceeding, Woodward writes, Pottinger quietly reminded Felt that he was under oath. Then he offered to withdraw the question as irrelevant to the subject of investigation, which was illegal break-ins conducted by the FBI in pursuit of anti-war radicals from the Weather Underground. Felt quickly accepted the offer. Pottinger told Woodward, who didn't confirm or deny his conclusion, that he would keep the knowledge to himself. To his credit, Woodward writes, he did just that. Pottinger was a company man. He knew how to keep secrets. He also knew when not to ask questions, and in this case, he even knew to withdraw a certain question from the public record so as to maintain hidden relationships and to protect other company men. Coincidentally, in October 2005, Stanley Pottinger was noted as mingling with a different J. Epstein in a short article in the Daily News entitled Safe Harbor in the Storm, which states, friends of Judy Miller, writer Mary Brenner, novelist and former federal prosecutor Stanley Pottinger, retiring Time Inc. editor-in-chief Norman Pearlstein, and their respective spouses and date, supped with the embattled New York Times reporter and her husband, Jason Epstein, at 11 Madison Wednesday night. Low-down spies said the merry group didn't chew on Miller's troubles, including the public pounding she has taken from her own newspaper. Jason Epstein was also the editor in charge of Random House, which, of course, Pottinger was publishing through. And it also protected Gloria Steinem in the 70s, bringing in buying the Red Stockings expose about her time at the CIA, and then having it removed from the book during libel readings. Soon after, the name Epstein was to become Pottinger's only focus of attention. In fact, as Pottinger was releasing The Boss, another event was about to happen, which was, years later, to drag Pottinger out of dull semi-retirement of a best-selling author and fling him back into a role as a legal eagle within the proverbial spotlight. The sexual allegations against Jeffrey Epstein first began being investigated in 2005, and he was initially arrested in July 2006 after a grand jury indicted him on a single count of soliciting prostitution. Over a year after Epstein's initial arrest, a benefit for Woodruff family was being held in New York during November 2007 to honor wounded U.S. service members. The fund had been set up after ABC's Bob Woodruff had nearly been killed by a roadside bomb while he was working in Iraq the previous year. Bruce Springsteen, Robin Williams, and Conan O'Brien were some of the stars there to entertain the crowd. The Asbury Park Press reported on the 9th of November, stating the audience included celebrities like Stephen Colbert of Comedy Central and former Sopranos star James Gandolfini, and a large number of military personnel and their families. One father was especially happy. His son, a Marine, was returning home the next day. To see New York turn out like this for the military is really touching, said Stan Pottinger, whose son, Matt, just finished a tour of Iraq's Anbar province. J. Stanley Pottinger was now becoming known as plain old Stan, and his son, Matthew Pottinger, was looking to follow in his father's footsteps, heading towards a career in intelligence. Yeah, we'll get to that. Stan Pottinger, super spy. It was to be one of the biggest intelligence-linked cases in history, which eventually dragged Stanley Pottinger out of his comfortable retirement. Although when and how this happened, and which individuals initiated Pottinger's involvement in the Epstein case, isn't clear. However, by 2014, Stanley Pottinger, agent of the Central Intelligence Agency, began to approach a specific legal team representing victims of Jeffrey Epstein. In Brad Edwards' book, Relentless Pursuit, he talks about his relationship with Stanley Pottinger. Edwards has acted as a central legal representation for some of the most well-known Epstein victims, and what he describes is the forming of a cat-and-mouse alliance which led to him to becoming more and more paranoid as the situation developed. Bizarrely, in his book, Edwards openly paints Pottinger as a CIA super spy, to an extent which leaves the reader in no doubt that Edwards knew Stanley Pottinger was a CIA agent almost immediately. When recalling his first encounter with J. Stanley Pottinger, Edwards writes, I was at home in bed at 11:30 on Friday night when my phone rang. As soon as I said hello, the voice on the other end went into a wind-up that eventually became familiar. Let me introduce myself, the caller said. My name is Stan Pottinger. I'm sure you get a load of crazy calls about this subject matter, Jeffrey Epstein. But hear me out. I have a civil rights practice in New York. Before that, I was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department in Washington. In addition to my own current work, I sometimes work on cases with David Bowie. I've been contacted to represent one of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and I have told David about it. We understand that you're the expert, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. I'm calling to see if it makes sense to work together. David Bowie, the man who Pottinger refers to, is one of the most prominent solicitors in America. His firm, Bowie Schiller Flexner LLP, was founded in 1997, and since its formation has been involved in extremely significant cases, including some very famous faces. Between 1991 and 1993, David Bowie had worked on the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, where the Bowie Schiller Flexner website explains that he was responsible for recovering 1.2 billion from companies who sold junk bonds to failed savings and loans associations. What his official website fails to mention is the case in which he's charged with investigating while he was at the FDIC, Drexel Burnham Lambert Group, DBL, under the leadership of Michael Milken, had dealt in junk bonds, and by the time Bowie was employed to begin investigating, Milken had already pleaded guilty to 6 felony charges and agreed to pay $400 million in restitution. In fact, the FDIC and the Resolution Trust Corporation, an agency managed by the FDIC, which was created by Congress the previous year to sell or merge hundreds of failed savings associations related to DBL collapse, were believed to be among the largest creditors in the DBL bankruptcy. It was the end of the last millennium when Bowie made his name, when he served as special trial counsel for the United States Department of Justice in its antitrust suit against Microsoft. This was then followed by one of the biggest and most important court cases in history relating to the US election in 2000. Bowie served as the lead counsel representing Al Gore while he was legally challenging the Florida vote count in the infamous case involving hanging chads, which eventually saw George H.W. Bush take office. Bowie had become a trusted lawyer for the establishment, and even though he was representing some of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, he still decided to represent Harvey Weinstein when the movie mogul was accused of various sexual assaults. Weinstein hadn't only employed Bowie to defend him, he had also hired Unit 8200 linked private Israeli intelligence firm Black Cube, whose primary objective, as the New York Times reported, was providing intelligence which will help the client's efforts to completely stop the publication of new negative articles in the leading New York newspaper. And obtaining content from a book that was to include harmful negative information on and about the client. The episode was reported in 2017 New York article, which stated, on July 11th, 2017, Harvey Weinstein's attorney, David Bowie, of law firm Bowie Schiller Flexner LLP, signed a contract with Black Cube, an Israeli private intelligence agency operated by former members of Israel's Mossad intelligence service. The contract describes Black Cube's tactics and goals in its work for the client, identified in other documents as Weinstein. The firm's first objective, as stated in the contract, was to uncover information that would help stop the publication of new negative newspaper story, which sources said was a New York Times story focused on sexual misconduct allegations against Weinstein. Its second objective was to obtain a manuscript of a book that sources identified as the memoir of actress Rose McGowan, who had accused Weinstein of rape. Harvey Weinstein was certainly not the only sensitive and controversial client who Bowie took on. In fact, Bowie's name also came up during the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. The New York Post reported Biden and Bowie's business dealings in an article from 2nd of December 2022 entitled Hunter Biden's former law firm received $10 million in forgiven COVID loans while donating $1 million to Dems. The article points out that Hunter Biden was the disgraced son of President Joe Biden, was at one time employed by Bowie Schiller Flexner, with reporter Miranda Devine also mentioning that David Bowie is a long-time Joe Biden donor. A former partner of Bowie Schiller Flexner, Hampton Dellinger, was also tipped to lead the Justice Department Policy Office in 2021. And like Stanley Pottinger himself, Dellinger was rewarded with the position of Assistant Attorney General. Bowies had been heavily involved in the Theranos scandal too. Theranos Inc. had been sold to investors and customers as a breakthrough technology company, which was founded in 2003 by a 19-year-old named Elizabeth Holmes. The company claimed to have devised blood tests that required very small amount of blood, and that tests on samples could be performed rapidly and accurately. However, they were false claims, and in May 2018, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou had exposed the scandal, while he also claimed David Bowie used thuggish tactics. Although Bowie rejected the last claim, he did state that overall his reporting on Theranos was excellent. But when the Theranos scandal did break, Bowie didn't only become the lead legal counsel for the company, he also joined their board of directors, a move which saw accusations of conflict of interest. In 2016 article entitled David Bowie's Dual Roles at Theranos Setup Conflict, the author explains, depending on what unfolds at Theranos, Mr. Bowie may be put in a position where he either has to protect the company as its lawyer or the shareholders as director. While Bowie would make such an unusual decision to risk creating a conflict of interest while he represented Theranos may only make sense if you examine those who sat on the company's board. As the latter New York Times article goes on to say, Mr. Bowie, of course, is no expert on blood testing technology, but in evaluating the firm's technology, he will get little to no help from his fellow board members. Before the first journal article appeared, the board of Theranos had no outside scientific experience. It consisted mainly of statesmen, including 2 former senators and even Henry Kissinger. Henry, there you are, all over the place. At this point, Stanley Pottinger was not officially on the books at David Bowie's law firm. However, as we will learn, as Edwards put it, Pottinger was being used as David Bowie's personal 007. Whether Edwards had any idea of Pottinger's previous intelligence connections remains unclear until later in his book. There was one fact that was becoming very clear, however: Pottinger's desire to be involved in Epstein's case. Edwards again talks about the second conversation he had with Pottinger, writing, "On our second late night call, Stan thanked me for my help and told me that if anything ever came up, he would like to work with me, and said David Bowie would too. He then asked me if I had anything else in the works against Epstein, so I told him a little bit about the current status of the CVRA case. This led to a long conversation about the breadth of the criminal enterprise headed by Jeffrey Epstein and my ultimate goal to overturn Epstein's non-prosecution agreement with the feds. He then reminded me that he was the former U.S. Assistant Attorney General and that David and his law firm were well regarded by the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York and around the country. He said, 'What you're doing is admirable. Your goal is to get Epstein prosecuted, but rather than try and undo this bad deal,' referring to the MPA, 'isn't there anyone you represent who has traveled on Epstein's plane or been abused at any of his other locations?' I found the question unnerving, especially given the timing of his call and my current talks with Virginia. I'm admittedly quick to be suspicious, but my mind was racing." The language Brad Edwards uses to describe Pottinger's behavior throughout this book is exceedingly odd. He uses such terminology as "I found the questions unnerving," and that it set off a bunch of suspicions. And his choice of phrasing gets even more astonishing later. In fact, it was very clear by Brad Edwards' own recollection of events that he believed Pottinger's involvement signified something else. For whatever reason, Edwards didn't hide his concern when he wrote his book. Was Stan working with Epstein? Was David? Had Epstein tagged Virginia's passport in order to receive a ping from the Justice Department if she ever entered the country? Despite these thoughts, which were a bit frantic, I told Stan that I had recently been contacted by Virginia Roberts and divulged part of her story that had already been made public, but nothing else. A couple of days passed and Stan called again. "David and I would like to meet with you. How soon could you fly to New York?" I gave him my proposed itinerary. He told me to call him when I landed, and he would tell me where to meet them. Waiting until the last minute to figure out where to have lunch is not an unusual thing for people to do in New York, but given my lurking suspicions, I found it odd. It smelt like an Epstein setup. In context to the series you're currently reading, Brad Edwards appears to have recognized Stanley Pottinger and David Bowie's could both be serious intelligence assets. He also claims to have attempted to take precautions by buying a specialized recording device that looked like a USB flash card from a local spy shop in Fort Lauderdale. Some may ask why Edwards believed it was necessary to take such measures to protect himself, but he soon explains that he had already discovered a connection linking David Bowie with Jeffrey Epstein. Thinking that I was headed for a setup, I tried to remember the connections I was aware of between Jeffrey Epstein and his friends that might have tied him to David Bowie's law firm. I looked through Alfred Rodriguez's journal and couldn't find David. Next, I reviewed copies of his message pad that had been confiscated from the trash pulls at Epstein's house. I paged through calls from former National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, former United States Senator George Mitchell, and movie producer Harvey Weinstein more than a decade before he would be arrested on rape charges. I continued flipping through the messages, and then there it was, a call from David Bowie. According to the message pad, he had called Jeffrey Epstein's house on February 25th, 2005. There was no message associated with the call, only a handwritten note that someone named David Bowie had personally called and left his cell phone number, asking that Jeffrey call him back. Was this a benign thing? A return business call to a business call placed by Epstein? Or was he, as I feared, Epstein's lawyer, a spy? There was only one way to find out. Although Bradley Edwards had researched Pottinger a little, he had only gleaned the basics. Edwards was clearly concerned that he was actually embroiled in an intelligence-linked operation of some kind. Throughout his recollection of the events, Edwards points at the obvious discrepancy in Bowie's and Pottinger's stories. However, he continues to meet with them, regardless of his various stated concerns. In fact, the one extremely notable point about Brad Edwards' constant suspicions is that it never seemed to stop him becoming further embroiled with Pottinger or Bowie's. For any one reading Edwards' recollections of events, the string of bizarre encounters with staggering coincidences he describes becomes almost farcical. Together, Pottinger and Bowie had multiple significant connections to Jeffrey Epstein that Edwards himself chose to ignore. At this meeting, Pottinger was also to make a stunning admission about a relatively unknown connection between himself and Jeffrey Epstein. Edwards writes, "I spent most of the lunch interrogating Stan about his past and present, making him comfortable until he volunteered that he had known Epstein. He had worked with him briefly many years before. Really, Stan explained that after he'd left the Justice Department in Washington, he worked as an investment banker in New York, where a client introduced him to Epstein. They were not in the same firm, but the two of them had shared an office for a few weeks. He may have thought he was being candid and forthcoming, but all it did was ramp up my suspicions. The story of Pottinger and Epstein sharing an office as an investment banker during the early 1980s may be a very cozy story to hide much more sinister truth. It must be taken into consideration that during the early 1980s, Pottinger and Epstein were both involved in arms smuggling to Iran on behalf of the intelligence agencies alongside Cyrus Hashemi and Adnan Khashoggi. This is also the same period in time when Pottinger suddenly accrued the majority of his wealth. There may be significant questions to be asked about how Pottinger made his millions. The revelations that Pottinger and Epstein shared an office should already have piqued Edwards' concern, but instead of leaving the meeting there, he was treated to another twist in the tale. I asked if David knew Jeffrey, and Stan said as far as he knew the answer was no. At this point, Stan really wasn't doing anything to dispel my concerns, since I knew that in the past David had left a private message for Jeffrey to call him. Stan wanted to talk about Epstein, but I delayed that. When we finished eating, I told Stan it didn't make much sense for me to explain things twice, once to him and once to David. So why didn't we ask David to come join us? Stan suggested instead that we go to David's office. I got my backpack and we jumped in the cab to 575 Lexington Avenue. But this merely raised another red flag. David's office was in the same building as Jeffrey Epstein's main attorney, Darren Indyke's office. Edwards claims to have been suspicious about Pottinger from almost the get-go. But if that were true, how many coincidences was it going to take before he stopped building on their relationship? Bowies was based in the same building as Epstein's lawyers. He was also confirmed contact with Epstein in 2005. Pottinger had admitted once sharing an office with Epstein. All these connections should have set off serious alarms for Brad Edwards, and he claims they did. Yet he relentlessly continues to strengthen their relationship. Edwards was being welcomed into a very exclusive club, and he wasn't turning around, regardless of the many significant and obvious conflicts of interest. Brad Edwards admitted in his book that he had been extremely suspicious of Pottinger, yet he was also clearly enamored with his new friend Stan. Even though Edwards claimed to have suspected Pottinger of both working for Epstein and being an intelligence operative, he still went into business with him. So, I asked, what do you think about the idea of us having a New York office and asking Stan Pottinger if he wants to be my law partner? Both reacted almost immediately with reasons why they thought it would be a great fit. But look, Stan, in my view, was David Bowie's personal 007. Not that either of them would put it that way, but I did. I thought that there would be a pretty good chance that my proposition would make Stan laugh, though he'd be too diplomatic to do it out loud. I mean, who was I kidding? But I didn't have much time to game the idea. My old firm was winding down fast, and I was trying to do a million things to get a new one started. It took Stan no time to say, I'm in. David Bowies, he said, had told him a long time ago that forming a small firm had many appealing advantages and tempted virtually all lawyers at one time or another. While Bradley Edwards decided to write Relentless Pursuit is unclear. All throughout the book, he clearly identifies Pottinger as a probable intelligence agent and David Bowies as being likely ally of Jeffrey Epstein himself. Yet he continued to forge a closer relationship with them to the point that he appears to be totally complicit. Virginia Giuffre had reportedly met Bowies in 2014 via Pottinger's introduction. On the 7th of July 2019, the Miami Herald ran a front-page story entitled Dershowitz versus Bowies. Epstein case brings renewed intensity to legal titans' war, speaks of an intense battle between two super lawyers. The article states, Pottinger, who represented Giuffre in 2014, said it was he who enlisted Bowies to assist in her case because he predicted that Giuffre would become a target of vicious attacks by powerful and wealthy men she had identified as having sex with her under Epstein's direction. She needed an aggressive lawyer, one who could stand up to the kind of pressure they anticipated. Among those Pottinger mentioned whom Frey claimed to have sex with were Dershowitz and Les Wexner, an Ohio billionaire who is owner of limited brands and Victoria's Secret's clothing stores, according to Pottinger's affidavit. Edwards' recollection of events had described Pottinger as a freelance actor or as David Bowie's personal 007. It was clear that Pottinger and Bowie's had come as a pair. However, Pottinger's version of events saw Bowie's as the one who was called in to help. I'm not sure why the you wills there. The art of spycraft. Brad Edwards also wrote how impressed he was in the way Stan Pottinger communicated with former Epstein employee Maria Farmer when they first went to meet her together, with Edwards stating, "That trip was really beginning my relationship with Stan. The way he asked questions of Maria and evaluated the evidence was impressive. It was very conversational. Before that trip, Stan and I had not spent much time talking beyond discussing the facts and strategy behind the various cases that had sprouted. I left Paducah impressed that David had sent someone as savvy as Stan to Kentucky within hours, and even more impressed by Stan's quick study of the situation. Stanley Pottinger still had a way with the ladies, and Maria Farmer soon caught his eye. Farmer began a romantic relationship with Stan Pottinger, which, according to multiple sources, lasted many years and was extremely complex. In fact, Maria Farmer was to play various roles in both Epstein case and the life of J. Stanley Pottinger. Maria Farmer has been widely touted as the first victim to report Epstein to the FBI. However, the FBI have so far not been able to produce any evidence of Farmer's supposed report. Alongside claiming to be the first person to report Epstein's operation to authorities, she has repeatedly claimed that Epstein and Maxwell embarked on a campaign to ruin her life and her career. In fact, Farmer makes many unfalsifiable claims about the Epstein case. Maria Farmer has also spoken in detail about her dealing with journalist Vicky Ward, who she describes as an agent and the most evil person on the planet. She claims that Ward originally interviewed her and her sister Annie about Epstein's operation, with the intention to write an article and would expose Epstein's crimes, but instead the article became a puff piece for the billionaire child trafficker. On many occasions, Maria Farmer has stated clearly on a variety of platforms that she had been forced into hiding. She has told various podcasts that she feared for her life and that she was terrified of Epstein and Maxwell's reach, as well as their many powerful associates and accomplices, including Eileen Guggenheim and Vicky Ward. However, not only was Farmer not in hiding, she was also publicizing her art to the very people she was supposedly in hiding from. And that's there, Maria Farmer. Claims to have been forced into hiding, where she was alone for 25 years and had to change her name. However, she had a Facebook, Twitter, and continued to using her own name. On the 11th of October 2006, while she claims to have been in hiding in a cabin in the woods in North Carolina, Maria Farmer was exhibiting her work in the New York Academy of Arts annual Take Home a Nude benefit art auction to aid the Academy's scholarships and educational programs. On the benefit committee for the latter event was the same Vicky Ward, who was supposedly part of the reason why Maria Farmer decided that she needed to go into hiding in the first place. Also at the same event, where Maria Farmer was exhibiting her work, was the person who apparently originally introduced Farmer to Epstein and Maxwell, Eileen Guggenheim. There was also some famous backers involved in the 2006 Take Home a Nude benefit, such as actor Lee Schreiber, Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards, and even King Charles III. In 2008, Farmer formed a business in North Carolina under her own name, Maria Christine Farmer, and registered the company, which was called Lysistrata LLC to 962 Caps Mill Road in Dobson, North Carolina. She stated on videos featured above that living in Caps Mill was akin to hiding in North Carolina in the woods, describing the region where she was based and the people who lived there as very backwards and really weird. However, the Caps Mill estate, which was once an old grist mill, sits on 5.24 acres of picturesque countryside. And Maria Farmer's own website describes a large stream with waterfalls which runs through the property and offers plenty of fantastic views. While Maria Farmer claims to have been in hiding, she also maintained a Facebook account under her own name along with a Twitter account, and even her own namesake website, mariafarmer.com, too. Farmer had claimed that she had originally met Epstein and Maxwell when Eileen Guggenheim apparently forced her to sell a painting at a discounted price to the pair. Considering Farmer was apparently in fear for her life, some of her activity on social media accounts in 2011 seems especially puzzling. This is her Twitter account. Anyone know how to reach Eileen Guggenheim from the New York Academy of Arts, who she's in hiding for? That's in 2011. Regardless of when or how they first met, the available evidence suggests that once recruited by Pottinger, Maria Farmer played a much more complex role than has been previously revealed or has previously been revealed. Between their initial meeting in 2016 and the takedown of Jeffrey Epstein in 2019, Maria Farmer was even employed by J. Stanley Pottinger and David Bowie. In 2017, two profit-making enterprises were created by Stan Pottinger, the Federal Anti-Fraud Enforcement LLC and Q-TAM Consultants LLC. Both were registered at his Twin Lakes home in South Salem, New York. The Federal Anti-Fraud Enforcement LLC even lists Maria Farmer on their website as their chief administrator of website services. Registered to the FAE alongside Stanley Pottinger and Maria Farmer were David Bowie, Brittany Henderson, Shanna Prager, Margaret Cassidy, and John LaTemple. Farmer is noted on the FAE website as having over 30 years of experience with research and intellectual property design, and she also noted as the CEO of Matisse Degas Atelier LLC. Farmer's FAE profile page describes her as their chief researcher and editor for online news and information, and the site states that her experience includes a previous role focused on web research, design, editing, and postings. It was in a court docket dated 16th of April 2019 when Maria Farmer first began to be known as a witness and victim in the case against Jeffrey Epstein. Virginia L. Gouffre is listed on the plaintiff as the plaintiff on Maria Farmer's affidavit for case 1 semicolon or colon 19 CV 03377 LAP S, where longtime Epstein lawyer Alan Dershowitz is listed as the defendant. Farmer's affidavit isn't very long and contains only 9 carefully worded statements, but the story she tells is very important for 2 reasons. Firstly, the evidence she gives directly implicated Alan Dershowitz, who is one of the star lawyers for Jeffrey Epstein's legal counsel, in sexual activity involving schoolgirls. Secondly, Farmer's tale of being sexually assaulted by Epstein completely shatters an otherwise concrete criminal profile. Epstein had been a notorious paedophile, targeting girls mainly between the age range of 13 and 18 years old, whereas Maria Farmer was approaching her mid-20s during the alleged encounter. Farmer's characterization of the abuse she claims to have encountered is also not fitting with the wider criminal profile of both Epstein and Maxwell. In fact, with such a large array of evidence and testimony available, we are able to build up a very accurate criminal profile for Epstein, whose offending was very systematic. In 2009, there was another bizarre twist in this already very complicated tale. In mid-September 2019, 2 New York Times journalists, Jake Bernstein and Emily Steele, were invited to the Manhattan offices of David Bowie. Like with Brad Edwards, when he originally met with Pottinger and Bowies, Bernstein and Steele were asked to leave their phones and laptops with security, and they were brought in to meet a man who NPR later described as a hard-drinking, burly man who promised that he could link powerful politicians and globe-trotting luminaries to the late Jeffrey Epstein, the financier and sexual predator. The man went by the name Patrick Kessler and appears to have been either a con artist or plain set up by Pottinger and Bowies to make a lot of money. Regardless, this stunt was about to backfire spectacularly. The man said that he was using the name Patrick Kessler as a pseudonym for his own protection, and claimed to have damning videos of prominent men engaged in sex acts with women and children at Epstein's properties. Kessler apparently produced blurry stills of sex acts which he claimed were genuine as proof. The aforementioned NPR article stated, but the informant Kessler appears to have been a fraud, and he has since vanished. Even so, he inspired an investigation by the Times, not of Epstein, but of one of the country's most famous lawyers. In a 5,400-word expose published on November the 30th and an hour-long television show, The Times placed Bowies at the center of the narrative that insinuates deceit and greed inside a morally corrupt legal system. Kessler had originally approached the Winchester Star in Virginia with the same story which the reporters recorded. On that occasion, Kessler told the Shenandoah Valley-based journalist that he had consulted with a specific lawyer. So the reporters contacted the lawyers Kessler mentioned, and soon the story began to unravel. One of the reporters later stated, "When he did not show up a week later, I thought, well, this guy's a crackpot, or, a fabulist. Somebody who just likes to spin stories or just wasted our time," said Winchester Star reporter Evan Goodnow. And so I kind of dismissed it. However, the same man was seemingly able to hoodwink Pottinger and Bowies with the same ruse. In the first meeting between the Times reporter and Kessler, both David Bowies and J. Stanley Pottinger were present, and Stan the Man was to play a central role in this debacle, which threatened to undermine the entire Epstein case. It should also be noted that with the fallout of Iran-Contra, all messages seeking comment were ignored by Pottinger before he vanished into thin air. Kessler shared more awkward information, which Pottinger would have surely wanted to remain hidden, as the aforementioned NPR article stated. Kessler shared with the Times texts that Pottinger had sent in, which he had drawn up a hot list of prominent men as possible targets. Bowies was not copied into the exchange. The Times wrote, "It seemed to Kessler like Bowies and Pottinger were plotting to use his footage to demand huge sums from billionaires. He said it looked like blackmail," said the blackmailer. Oh, potential. In fact, Pottinger suggests in the text messages that lawyers could make up 40% of the money they negotiated through private settlements. David Falkenflick, the reporter for NPR, also wrote, "Pottinger confirmed the texts were authentic." The paper reported Pottinger said he had been deceived by Kessler to get him to share what videos and other documentation he had against Epstein's friends. Pottinger also told the paper he informed the FBI and federal prosecutors about the material Kessler's claimed to have. We have time to do Las Vegas, but just barely. Can you review your visual evidence to be sure some of or all is indisputably him? If so, we can make it work. I blurry doubt for, of course, this is all a matter of degree, but it will need to pass muster. If blurry, I will review. Stanley Pottinger's little tongue poke out face. Quite amazing jobby there. Pottinger and Boyce were seemingly ready to make a lot of money from Kessler and the information he was supplying. However, Falkenfleck later quotes that he describes what he describes as the defining passage in a New York Times article, which originally broke the story, entitled Jeffrey Epstein, Blackmail and a Lucrative Hot List, which reads, in the end, there would be no damning video, no funds pouring into a new foundation. Mr. Boyce and Mr. Pottinger would go from toasting Kessler as their whistleblower and informant to torching him as a fraudster and a spy. Kessler was a liar, and he wouldn't expose any sexual abuse, but he would reveal something else. The extraordinary, at times deceitful measures the elite lawyers deployed in an effort to get evidence that could be used to win lucrative settlements and keep misconduct hidden, allowing perpetrators to abuse again. Mr. Boyce had publicly decried such secret deals as a rich man's justice, a way that powerful men buy their way out of legal and reputational jeopardy. This is how it works. Brad Edwards was actually the man to put Kessler in touch with Pottinger. The New York Times article also states, Mr. Pottinger recalled that Mr. Edwards warned him about Kessler, saying that he was endearing, spooky, and loves to drink like a fish. By all accounts, Pottinger made a concerted effort to befriend Kessler, even inviting him over to his apartment and presenting him with a copy of his 2005 book, The Boss. Pottinger even signed Kessler's copy, writing, here's to the great work you are to do. Happy to be a part of it. Pottinger also drafted a contract for Kessler to bring him on as a client, with the agreement stating, for reasons revealed to you, I prefer to proceed with this engagement under the name Patrick Kessler. Soon, Kessler vanished. Not surprised. And the affair blew up publicly in Boyce and Pottinger's face. They had invited a fraudster into their midst, seemingly because of how lucrative it could be to essentially blackmail or surreptitiously influence the powerful men who abused the women they were meant to be representing. This was exactly the same kind of crime which Epstein himself was renowned for committing. Curiously, when the Daily Mail reported on the Kessler affair on the 1st of December 2019, they were, of course, distracted by the idea of a potential hot list emerging and the potential of a video emerging which might show rich and powerful men engaging in sex acts. This salacious desire by the press to have a tangible evidence of Epstein's influence operation was fervent during 2019. The same Daily Mail article, should say, also goes on to quote one of Pottinger's ex-girlfriends, Epstein employee Maria Farmer, as saying, the existence of tapes would support the theory that Epstein may have been blackmailing people who engaged in illegal behavior at his homes, alleged Maria Farmer. Alleged victim Maria Farmer told CBS the late paedophile kept surveillance camera footage of some of the rooms inside the Manhattan mansion and that he stored it in a safe. Although there are plenty of reports, especially in 2019, into surveillance equipment at Epstein's various properties, so far no evidence has emerged to back up the theory that Epstein was recording his targets for reasons of compromise. While this is something Epstein was believed to have done, it was definitely a theory that the prosecution team wanted to project out in 2019. Soon after, Maria Farmer wasn't only telling tales of surveillance equipment. The majority of the best Epstein reporting in 2019 was no longer happening on the mainstream outlets, such as NPR and New York Times. 2019 was also a year when people such as Whitney Webb, Jason Vermaas, and others on the independent media scene were beginning to break Epstein-related stories, which the MSM had not dared to touch. In fact, both Webb and Vermaas soon became the focus of Farmer's attention. In various interviews, she started using language that crossed boundaries. This even led to Alan Dershowitz himself writing an article for Newsmax.com entitled Key Witness in Epstein Case Made Anti-Semitic Claims. Dershowitz quoted Maria Farmer's rhetoric in the article, which included lines such as, "I had a hard time with all Jewish people. I think it's all the Jews. I think Jewish DNA is better. They think Jewish DNA is better than the rest of us. And all the Jewish people I met are pedophiles that run the world economy." That's a fucking line. All the Jewish people I met are pedophiles that run. Wow. This gave Dershowitz plenty of ammunition to use, and Maria Farmer's questionable rhetoric continued until recently. In fact, Maria, and it continues on. In fact, Maria Farmer is now publicly considering converting to Judaism. If Alan Dershowitz had been aware of Maria Farmer's sexual relationship with J. Stanley Pottinger, his response may have been very different. It may have also been noted that in 2022, Virginia Giuffre dropped her allegation against Dershowitz, stating that she may have made a mistake. It is clear that Dershowitz had been central to Epstein's operation, and that many people still believe that he was involved in some form of abuse. Whether or not people's suspicions are true, many of the attacks against Dershowitz may have been a tactic organized by Bowies and Pottinger in an attempt to force Epstein to lose one of his star legal advisors. The Epstein Ultimatum. As we approach the death of the most infamous paedophile of the modern era, there are many different factors which come into play. Epstein wasn't simply an investment banker, property developer, high-level influencer, and sexual compromiser. He also had significantly impactful relationships around the globe. Because Epstein was a high-level intelligence agent, even when Epstein was most under fire, he seemed to be relatively at ease for a man with so many skeletons in his closet. Epstein owned everything. It appeared that his success came from his relentless compromising of people's integrity. His legal team, led by Darren Indyke, shared an office building with Bowies, just as Epstein had shared an office with Pottinger. Bowies also originally practiced. Bowies, whose original practice was located in Florida, had been in confirmed contact with Epstein from as early as 25th of February 2005. Pottinger had lived 500 meters from Epstein, and they had the same comrades when arms smuggling in Iran. But at least Edwards didn't have an inappropriate relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Well, that depends on what one deems as appropriate. Brad Edwards explains in his own words. This is unbelievable. "Brad, it's Jeffrey. Let's meet face to face." When I asked him why, he responded, "I want to see if there's a way for us to finally get divorced from one another." This was a way of implying that he wanted to find a way to resolve all cases that involved him, including those where he was not an actual party. The call told me that he was concerned. It was one thing when he was being sued and could control the legal defense team. Amazingly, Brad Edwards admits that he was regularly meeting Jeffrey Epstein at Starbucks in Boca Raton from around 2015. It's not like Edwards was unaware of how this may look. Yes, this is highly unusual. We were both represented by lawyers, but things between us were far beyond anything lawyers could fix. In fact, every time our lawyers were involved, it only made things worse. Some small part of the coffee shop conversation could be classified as confidential settlement discussion, although the reality is that it was just gamesmanship, part of an 8-year legal chess game between a genius sociopath and me, a lawyer in the business of playing legal chess against bad guys. This atypical relationship, represented by regular meetings at Starbucks between the two, continued until Epstein's arrest in 2019. In reality, there was very little that was atypical about the Epstein case. A few weeks after his last coffee shop conversation with Edwards, the infamous Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, and within a few months, his suicide while in custody was being reported. From March 2005, when the first police investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's operation began, allies of the financier had closely managed the case. Eventually, the scale to which the first case had been undermined by Epstein's team became almost common knowledge. As I stated in the opening to this article, Epstein was faced with an obvious ultimatum in 2005. If he took no action, the consequences would be dire. For a high-level fixer like Epstein, inaction was not an option. In May 2006, when the Palm Beach police filed a probable cause affidavit which led to his arrest in July that year, Epstein should have been jailed, denied bail, sent to trial, and found guilty. He should have then served the rest of his life behind bars. However, instead of serving a lifetime in jail, he served just over 12 months of his 18-month sentence. As a sex offender, Epstein should have served his time in state prison, but he was instead housed at the private wing of Palm Beach County Stockade. In fact, Epstein had a litany of privileges which were not afforded to other prisoners, and even his cell door was mostly left unlocked. To get this sort of special treatment, one has to have the best legal team on the planet working directly on your case. David Bowie was already in touch with Epstein. Pottinger had multiple associations with both men, and they were based in the same building as Darren Indyke, Epstein's lead legal advisor. Pottinger was a man who had been brought in to fix some of the most controversial cases in American history. MLK, Watergate, Kent State, Wounded Knee, Orlando Letelier, Iran-Contra, the October Surprise, and the case against Jeffrey Epstein. There was no one better to manage the Epstein affair, and the fact that no one had so far figured out Pottinger's previous associations with Epstein is testament to the level of widespread, multi-platform corruption involved. But there is even more pertinent question, which must be asked now that we are aware of Pottinger's extremely significant role throughout history. How deep does this corruption go? There are not many times throughout history where an investigative journalist gets to reveal a single thread which connects some of the biggest conspiracies known to man. But this case has not only supplied me with twists and turns in abundance, it has also led me to ask questions which 2 years ago I found almost unthinkable. It has been uncomfortable and awkward, and has been accompanied by a well-organized and multifaceted campaign to stop me reporting this information. And although it has not deterred me, some of the people involved initially seemed bizarre to me. People on all sides have been trying to influence my conclusions in exactly the same direction. This made no sense until I understood that almost every person who is involved in the Epstein case on all sides are in fact on the same side. To win the game, Jeffrey Epstein co-opted everyone. This meant not only forming his own defense, but also having significant input into the prosecution's case against him. J. Stanley Pottinger, David Bowie, and Darren Indyke all directly helped Epstein throughout his life, while Edwards indulged him at best and colluded with him at worst. Whatever happens, allowing a paedophile with a criminal profile like Epstein to be amongst the public was allowing him to continue offending. John Stanley Pottinger had been bought out of retirement for one last job, potentially the biggest job of his life. He is an important player involved. He is an important player involved in the takedown of Jeffrey Epstein. However, Jeffrey Epstein was not taken out because of his widespread sexual impropriety. He was taken out for another reason entirely. To understand why Jeffrey Epstein was taken out, we have to learn more about J. Stanley Pottinger's son, Matthew Pottinger, and take a journey deep into the heart of the CIA establishment. But that's a story for another day. For now, we are on the road to the takedown of Jeffrey Epstein, and this has been the Pottinger ultimatum. To close out, Brad Edwards describes a very curious interaction between himself and Pottinger just after they had first interviewed Maria Farmer. On the way back from meeting Farmer, Edwards recalls, I came to see that Pottinger is like the character, the wolf from Pulp Fiction. He can handle any situation for anyone at any time. Stan has this diplomatic quality about him that makes him able to blend into any situation in any country with very little background information at hand and accumulate knowledge. I asked him if David had hired him out of the CIA to be his operative because of his former high-end government connections and knack for traveling around the world to handle mysterious business meetings. He said he and David had become friends while playing softball on Sundays in Bedford, New York. I couldn't pitch and he couldn't hit, he said. So when the game was over, we were pretty much left alone to talk to each other. This sounded like a cover story to me. So I asked, but are you in the CIA or are you not? He laughed hard enough to make the question sound ridiculous and said, no, he was not. But I'm sure he didn't expect me to believe him. He then said, if I'm a James Bond, I sure am a poor man's version of him, which of course is exactly what the real James Bond would say, what a real James Bond would say. We both started laughing, and I honestly wasn't sure if we were laughing because it was funny or true. It took about 12 months of hard work and research to find all this information and to locate all the evidence used to form the Pottinger series. This included receiving help from some people who have been so important to maintain my sanity through this investigation. I want to thank the small group of friends who have been on this journey with me, so I can continue to uncover the truth. I also need your help. This is what journalism should look like. Help me produce the best investigative articles by supporting my work. Thank you for reading this series. Postscript. Matthew Pottinger, Vicky Ward, and David Bowies are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So was Jeffrey Epstein at one point. At the end is Schism and Newspaste. If you get to the end, and Schism and Newspaste joint podcast. So this is the Newshound, and it goes through basically all of the source material in this article. And at the bottom, you can see links to the articles. Sharing, of course, is useful. Become a patron or buy me a coffee, please. I need your help to continue doing this, and then you can see the rest of the stuff down there. Other links so to new stuff, and of course keywords. There you go. There's a pretty long article, as you see. 3 articles together, probably about 25,000 words or something, I suppose. Massively important to my life. Massively important in many ways.
Dead bodies floating in a watery shallow grave. Translucent girls flying in the sky like angels. Pools of blood fill the broken tiles. Hello, my name's Leslie Wexner, child swimwear and underwear pioneer. Here again to speak to you about one of my newest enterprises. Moving children can be hard. They are often non-responsive and hard to encourage. Moving children can be taxing. They are often uncooperative and don't like being trafficked. But here at Moving Children, we'll relinquish all your burdens with tried and tested mechanisms, so their journey is like a prison. Yes, here at Moving Children, we don't need to use a bludgeon with tried and tested ways to force the kids to stay. Moving children can be dangerous, but we make the whole thing work so that you can make them twerk. Moving children can be hard indeed. That's why we're here for you. Yes, here for you. Now back to you, my good friend Jeffrey. Moving children.